Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. In today's episode, I had a conversation with my friend, Jenny Chu. Jenny and I met when we were both studying with Sabrina Monarch, and we journeyed together in our studies for about a year. We both started off taking Sabrina's Evolutionary Astrology intensive course around the end of 2020, and then we essentially spent the entire 2021 together in Meteorite, which was a container for developing our own astrological voices, also facilitated by Sabrina. So if you listen to episode 2, where I had a panel discussion with the whole 2021 Meteorite cohort, you'll be pretty familiar with Jenny's voice because Jenny contributed some really fresh and powerful insights within that episode. In our conversation today, we revolved around time, the idea of time and our relationship with time. We talked about what time itself is, our sense of the spirit of time, our shared love for the work of the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli, who talked quite a bit about time, and also how astrology has changed our relationship with time. But I think it would be unfair for me to completely pin down this conversation to just revolving around time, because Jenny has a truly brilliant mind and she's also such a beautiful conversationalist that our discussion branched out in so many different ways that feels really organic and exciting. When I listened back, I really felt myself quite spellbound by a lot of things that Jenny had to say. In addition to time, we also explored the Buddhist idea of the middle path, the I-Ching and other forms of divination, and even how evolutionary astrology connects with Buddhism. All of these seemingly disparate topics are really brought together in such an organic, such a flowy way throughout this conversation, and I think that if you know a little bit about our astrological birth charts, you'll probably see why. Jenny's North Node is in Gemini, and it's in very, very close conjunction with my moon in Gemini. And I think you'll probably be able to hear that Gemini influence in this conversation. To me, it feels like this conversation was really lit up and connected with that energy of Gemini and Sagittarius in the best way possible. So, before we get into the episode, let me read you the bio that Jenny shared with the listeners of this podcast. Jenny M. Chu is a thinking artist, and she's an older sister to a younger brother and raised by two immigrant parents by way of Saigon and Hong Kong. She has studied evolutionary astrology with Sabrina Monarch, embodied astrology with Renee Sills, and is currently in the transits and predictive astrology cohort led by Oak of Oak Astrology that centers decolonization and the BIPOC experience. All right, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Jenny Chu. Hello, Jenny.
Hello, Jonathan.
Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for asking me, for being a part of this, like, squirrely and expansive and undefined, currently defining, in process conversation.
Absolutely. You were definitely one of the first people that I'm like, I really want to have you on. We're in the same class. We are currently studying with Sabrina. And I feel like you just have such an interesting mind, and you have this ability to kind of ground your knowing in kind of like an embodied sense. And this is something that I do want to get into with you. But I always really like to begin opening the space with the present moment and just, I'm curious to hear who you feel or you sense yourself to be today, and particularly in this chapter in your life?
Mm-hmm. Boy, that's such a big question. First of all, thank you so much for saying that, because I oftentimes feel, I think, so disembodied. I feel like I've oftentimes so heady that so much of my energy is oftentimes swirling around in my crown chakra. And even meditating, I mean, I try to keep a pretty regular meditation practice every single day where I sit for an hour. All of that energy actually oftentimes like centralizes around in my headspace, and I have to consciously push it down into my body. So I think right now, I mean, I'm not working. So I'm a Capricorn sun. Saturn is a big theme in my life. I have always been a little obsessed with time and also my experience and quality of time. And right now, because I'm not working, it's been for a while, for the last 4 weeks, I kept saying the word dislocated. I kept feeling very dislocated. There's like a dislocation in my feeling. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that my ego was telling me specific narratives and stories of how I was supposed to use my time. Interesting. Which is why I had wanted to talk about time when I had first filled out your form around this conversation, because I was meditating so much on the quality of my experience of being unscheduled. And also recognizing too that I had been prepared for this period of my life. I was prepared to be unscheduled. And even with the preparation of being unscheduled, how disorienting it was around our sort of earthbound narratives of productivity and efficiency and what it means to be human or a valuable human.
Yeah.
So right now I'm trying to trust more that the process and that my simply living is enough. And that, my process around studying astrology, and I'm also working through a lucid dreaming workbook, which has been both frustrating, but also I'm trying to go the middle path. I'm trying not to be too disciplined about it or too controlling around it, but I'm also not trying to be super loose. And really just trying to access this ability to speak to my subconscious in a way that is actually engaging with my conscious self, that there's like this bi-directionality. So I'm trying to access that through meditation, through studying astrology. I'm also part of this practice in transformative action cohort through East Bay Meditation Center right now. And it's all about secular mindfulness. So we're studying the foundations of mindfulness. And then the second half of the year will be about applying it towards transformative action work. So I feel like right now, everything that I'm doing feels like I'm trying to get very centered in myself, and really clear about what it is that I'm doing here. And in that process, I'm pulling like tarot cards every day. I literally asked the tarot deck, I was like, what is my marching orders today? And that has actually been a really powerful question. And also surrendering and relinquishing to those messages that are coming through different divination tools. I also, the Rumi Oracle, I just got the Rumi Oracle deck too, last month. I don't know if you know it. It's so beautiful.
I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds really exciting.
Yeah, it's a Rumi Oracle deck. And it was so interesting because I kept pulling the same card 3 times. I was like, okay, this is clearly the message that I need to receive. And the message essentially is surrender. It's trusting, it's knowing without knowing, which is such a paradoxical experience for me, especially being someone who has North Node and Vesta conjunct in Gemini in her ninth house, with a huge stellium of Sagittarius placements in her third house.
Yeah.
Right. So like I'm just on this axis of constant seeking and constant meaning making.
Mm-hmm.
And also recognizing too that if I don't figure out a way to take the middle path around my own intellect or my own way of making meaning in the world, that it can actually shut me off or close me off to those much more subtle messages in the subtle body, in my own subtle body, in the sort of like in the divine, in like my ability to access my subconscious, or my ability to like move and shape time in the way that I want to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just something that is like very present for me, is recognizing that I can't know everything. My South Node in Sagittarius really desires, I think, to be intuitively knowing immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in some ways to be, you know, this teacher of my own life. And it's, I think it oftentimes gets me in a lot of suffering. It comes across as suffering, which is
Mm-hmm.
also, yeah. And then I have to remind myself to be compassionate about it.
Right. You know, this conversation around like the third and the ninth house, Gemini and Sagittarius, to me is so, and you know, to those listening, you are Libra rising. So you kind of have them in, so you have your third house in Sagittarius and ninth house in Gemini, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really curious to hear this idea of the middle path, actually. I feel like that's kind of a beautiful entry point for us because, you know, you had mentioned the middle path being really important for you to walk, to discover. And I'm curious to hear what you think is at the heart of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it, so in Buddhism, the middle path really equates to equanimity.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to respond to every instant in your life without being wholly attached to it or repulsed by it, right? It's about actually coming to a place where, I mean, it's really about spaciousness, I think. And meditation is the ability to cultivate that equanimity. Like when you, I don't know if you've ever, I'm guessing that you meditate, but I don't know if you've ever done like a silent meditation retreat or have sat to the point where your body, it feels like the tendons that connect your hip bone to your knee are like tearing apart. Yeah. I mean, that's what it feels like when you're sitting for that long and you're not moving. And of course you can move, but you know, I'm a Capricorn sun. So I'm like, I am sitting. And then recognizing how that pain can shift and how it changes, and like actually your attachment to that sensation, like cultivating equanimity where you're not resisting the pain, you're not wholly attached to it, where you're obsessed with it, so that you can come out of meditation being able to make wiser decisions in your life.
Yeah.
So it's really about being able to cultivate that spaciousness, to be able to make decisions and choices that are maybe not in sort of direct alignment with our regular patterning as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the sort of like ability to figure out how to walk the middle path has been a huge practice of like recorrecting my Saturnian sensibilities around willfulness. For ever and ever. I'm 37 now. So it's been only really about the last 5 years or so that I've really cultivated this practice. But ever since before then, I always believed that I could do whatever I wanted to do if I just tried hard enough.
If
and you
plan. probably too.
Plan. If I was strong-willed enough, if I did all the internships, worked all the jobs, did all this stuff, that I would be able to get exactly what I wanted at the exact time that I wanted. And I just remember being in my 20s, like having this, there was also a lot of sort of Sagittarius themes in my 20s too, where it's just like, you know, this desire to do everything, but like also recognizing that I didn't have all the time in the world to do everything. I remember like in my mid 20s, I had this huge existential, like I was so depressed because I realized that I wasn't going to ever be able to in this lifetime read all the books that were ever published. It was just so, that's such a Sagittarius thing, you know, just like this, like, oh my God, I want to read the whole canon. And I was like, but I'm never going to be able to read everything that was published, because at this point there are more books published than I will ever be able to read.
Yeah.
And I think I really had to work to understand that I can't, that sort of, right, like that grasping and that desire to read more, to learn more, to do more, to be able to make things happen in this world because of my own life force. It's like aggressive, like very Mars energy life force going out and getting things done was causing me a lot of suffering. And then years later, which is also one of those, you know, hindsight 2020, years later, it's like the 2 internships that I took in my 20s, I ended up getting full-time positions at those jobs like years later. And then when I looked back, I was like, oh, like what I was cultivating back at 23 and 24 might not have manifested in a direct full-time position at 25 or 26. But then I went off to grad school and I came back and I didn't even have to apply for those jobs. I got offered both of those jobs at different times. And I was just like, oh, okay, so and I still didn't quite get it at that time until, and I know I've shared this anecdote in class before, but it wasn't until 2014 I saw Jim Carrey. And whatever you think about Jim Carrey, I know he's a little out there. He's also a Capricorn sun. But he gave a commencement speech at the Maharishi School, and he was giving a story, an anecdotal story about his father and about how his father he was so funny and he loved comedy. But what he ended up doing for 25 years of his life was that he ended up working as an accountant because he thought that that's what he was supposed to do to make sure that his family was fed.
Yeah.
And Jim Carrey tells a story about how his dad, after 25 years of working this job that he didn't love, he got laid off. Their family ended up losing their house. They were living on the streets. And Jim Carrey has this really beautiful reflection around, you can do something that you don't love for 25 years of your life and still fail at it. So why don't you do what you love? And then he goes on to say, I promise you, and I'm a product of this, that if you ask the universe for what you want and you don't control when or how, if you just keep working towards the thing that you want, when the universe opens the door for you, you'll be ready to walk through it. But you can't control when or how the universe is going to respond to those efforts. And that to me is, and when I remember listening to that speech, it was on YouTube, and it finally clicked. I realized, I was like, oh, so the thing that I can control is like my own, I can still control my own life force. I can still control the direction of the choices that I make, but I cannot control when the universe responds. I cannot control when that door opens, but that if I keep having the faith that my actions will lead up to when the universe is willing to co-create with you, that's the moment. And that's really what the middle path stands for me, is recognizing what is within our own control, what is within our own free will and our agency, but to not mess so much with the other stuff that we don't understand. It's what I was talking about earlier around the knowing, the faith and knowing without knowing, right? without a book telling me that the universe is going to open the door at this date.
Yeah.
Even though I try, I try, I commune with the I-Ching and I totally try, but then it's,
Yeah.
but also at the same time, you also can't force the I-Ching, because if you approach the I-Ching with a preconceived notion, the I-Ching is going to reflect back to you those distortions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes. So right now, all I'm trying to do is just to get clear.
It's funny because there's so much that was like coming up for me as you were speaking. The first one is that for someone who is feeling like maybe they're not doing a whole lot, you sound like you're doing a whole lot, and it sounds like you're really using your time really well. And also, like, some placements in your chart really like spoke to me. Like, you had mentioned Mars and the willpower. You do have it in the first house, but it's in the sign of Libra. And so there's something that you described there about, like, allowing yourself to tap into that willpower and into really exerting force, but then releasing yourself from the outcome. Like, I got this image of like someone who negotiates, right? Libra, the negotiator, who is just negotiating for the sake of just, principle, and not really thinking about brokering any kind of outcome in general, And also, the other thing the phrase that kept coming as you were speaking was how Saturn needs to learn to appreciate the squiggliness of time.
Yes.
Yeah. Because one thing that I was thinking about as you offered this topic, of really discussing about time, was the idea that there are many different types of time, right? And I even wonder, perhaps, is there Saturnian time? Is there Mercurial time? Is there Venusian time, right? And how do they all differ? So I kind of want to, take us back maybe a step to the mythic realm. One of the things that I've been sensing into is how, in a more animist framework, everything is infused with spirit. And I'm curious if time has a spirit. Who do you feel the spirit of time to be?
Oh, I love that. First of all, what is your definition of animus?
To me, it's a very loose definition. To me, the animus framework is in recognizing that there is life in everything, including things that we, in our perhaps colonial framework, consider to be inanimate objects, right? So there's a spirit to this desk, right? There's a spirit to this mic that I'm recording on right now.
Yeah.
And it's really a lens, because I don't think that it's necessarily a belief system, right? I think it's more about perhaps bending this idea of what spirit means and moving away from the idea that we can define spirit in like a materialistic sense, because even when we put conceptual boundary around what spirit is and what spirit is not, that in and of itself is an act of trying to limit spirit, right? So I'm really seeing, the animus framework in terms of that. And I think that in that sense, there is potential for us to be in conversation with any and all, really.
Yeah. Oh, I love that definition of it. And first of all, this conversation is making my brain go in like very Gemini. I'm like, oh, I want to talk about the word sati in Pali. That means that's, defined as mindfulness in English. I also want to talk about Carlo Rovelli's book that we both read called The Order of Time, which is an ironic title because there's actually no order to time.
Yes.
But before I go off on a tangent on both of those, in terms of the spirit of time, if it were a spirit, I heard once from a friend talk about divine timing. And there was a point in my life, very ungrounded, Jenny, that was just literally floating. I mean, I would go to work and I would answer my emails and I would do the adult things I needed to do. But other than that, the rest of my life was ordered in divine timing, which also meant that there were a lot of people in my life that would say, hey, we should get together. And I was like, oh yeah, like, you know, if our divine comes, like, let's just get together, which means we're not trying to schedule through text message or any sort of calendaring. Like if we run into each other, that's the sort of our divine time to be together. And like there just was so much of that energy, which is really beautiful when it works. But then my therapist reminded me that you can't simply operate. It's like too much heaven when you're operating in that space. Yeah. Like it's too much heaven in that like everything is ethereal. Like nothing can materialize if you're constantly operating in divine timing. Like there has to be a bridge towards some sort of manifestation, some anchoring to be able to make things work, right? So when I think of the animus of time, I want to experience time in that sort of divine feather in the wind. I'm like now on a tree leaf. I've like now floated onto a patch of moss. I'm like floating onto the sidewalk now. And now I've ended up in a child's pocket. Like that is how I want to experience time. Very much like the wind, really. But I would say that even though that is like aspirational, it isn't maybe super realistic to experience time in that way because of the sort of, you know, the consensus reality that we've agreed to in terms of our understanding of what time means.
Yeah.
And when I am left, I think without some sort of structural experience of time, those sorts of insecurities around the elusiveness of time can turn into real, like, egoic demons.
Yeah.
Which is why I think, you know, Carlos Rovelli's book, The Order of Time, has been such a therapeutic read for me, because in his book, time is not linear. It doesn't point in one direction. There is no one agreement or conception of time. Time moves faster at higher elevations than it does at sea level. So like there's literally multiple, and I love your example of Venusian time, Mercurial time, Jupiterian time. Like what are all these different times? And can we, I think, be in such alignment with life itself where we can actually figure out what time that we want to be aligned with would be a really beautiful, like that to me is a much greater sort of like divine experience of time.
Yeah.
And it also reminds me of, so I talked about the practice in transformative action cohort through East Bay Meditation Center. And I had our first gathering last month on a Sunday. And one thing that our teacher said that was actually really, and this is also about the quality of time. Like basically living is essentially your relationship with your quality of time. Let's just define it as that, right?
Yeah.
Time can be defined as our relationship towards the quality of our experience of time. Or at least that's how I'm defining it. That is not Carlos Rovelli's definition. I'm just defining it as that. And she was talking about how mindfulness, the definition in the English language around mindfulness, has really lost its meaning. So it comes from the Pali word sati. And in the American English conception, westernized conception of mindfulness, there's this experience of like, okay, I'm having this thought. I'm aware of this thought. I am aware of the sensation in my body. I'm aware that I am moving through space and that my feet are touching the ground. But she was saying that actually the Pali word sati is actually the precognitive and pre-verbal experiences of knowing. So it's actually before you come into actual awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you're in like perfect alignment with reality, where you're not locking it in any sort of conceptual framework. It's pre-verbal, precognition. And I think when I think about the sort of animus of time, it's that space. It's that space that is occupied before we've even conceptualized it as such, before we've even been able to name the quality of that time that we're experiencing. And I've been trying to meditate on that. Like, what does that mean? And the closest thing that I can really think of is those experiences when you just look into the sunset. Like, you can't define a sunset. You can say it's beautiful, certainly. Yeah. You can say it makes you feel at peace, but you literally cannot define the sort of phenomena of a sunset. And you can't define the phenomena. I don't know if you've ever seen the eclipse, but the eclipses were over the Pacific Northwest a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'd never seen a full total eclipse. And I just remember and I read actually a short story on the way, of course, because I'm heady. So on the way to the total eclipse, I was reading the short story, and even that experience, and I almost didn't want to read it because I didn't want the experience to be taken, or I didn't want the experience to be colored by this author's perception of it. But what was so incredible about witnessing this total eclipse was that even reading her story could not define the experience that I had of the sort of awe that I felt of watching the sun completely darkened and blacked out. And there is nothing to talk about the experience. Like, you could have a 98.9% total eclipse, but it is nothing like a total 100% eclipse.
Yeah.
And that to me is, I mean, and that was just like, in terms of time, like, time felt like it just stopped for that moment. And for some reason, I felt like I was transported back to Egypt too. It was like a very strange experience. We were in a field. We were in this field, I think on somebody's private property, but then a bunch of other people were also on this private property because the lines were so long. But we just pulled off on this random field, and there were bunnies. There were like random bunnies. Anyways, it was so incredible. And that experience to me was absolutely precognitive, pre-verbal. Mm-hmm. And that sort of sense of awe when you don't have, it hasn't entered the mind yet. It hasn't entered the mind. The sensation is like a full body knowing. Mm-hmm. And I would like time to feel like that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like as you were describing that very surreal experience, that very surreal scenery, what that brought to me was how few of those experiences we have nowadays, because of I think the way that we have as a society decided to construct time, right? Mm-hmm. There was something in Rovelli's book that really struck me around how time was not actually uniform in Europe, right? Before the invention of the trains. And then the trains have to arrive on time, right? Air quotes, on time. And then they kind of had to create that as a convention, right? So in a sense, our idea of time is closer to perhaps language, even language, in a sense that both language needs to be defined, and language is made by people who speak them. And at the same time, also how language can be destroyed, and you can totally use the same word to describe totally different things based on the context, right? You can introduce, like a virus is introduced to a computer system, you can introduce a new meaning, or a new word, and then it totally changes the conversation. So in that sense, I think what we're really getting at here is the idea that time as this really strict order, right, as the strict, perhaps, lieutenant that directs our lives is an invention.
Yeah.
And
100%.
that we are a participant, right? It's more accurate to the nature of time as we understand it today, that we insert ourselves into the discussion, into the meaning making. Yeah.
And into the relationship making.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think, I mean, Carlo Rovelli talks about our inability to actually understand time as it really is, because of our inability to see the details, of our inability to understand the details, because we have already conceptualized it as such, as this static sort of like, or maybe not static, but like this forward moving thing that never changes and moves and kind of like ticks along without any sort of relationship to anything else, and that it doesn't relate to anything else. Which is just, it's bonkers, because I think our actual lived experience of time is that it's always in relationship with something else.
Yeah.
Depending on which masses or which material things are interacting with each other, drastically changes the quality of our experience of time. I mean, I think about when you're hanging out with someone who is not as interesting, how that time can just stretch on forever, right? And there's this sort of constriction of feeling of just wanting to get away, versus somebody that the energies are aligned and everything just feels like the molecules are bouncing everywhere and thoughts are just forming at rapid speed, and like time just goes so quickly.
Yeah.
And I think about just like that simple experience of time. Like we know, I mean, our inherent, I think, beings have such wisdom in them, but because in Western culture, right, like talking about how do we decolonize the sort of Western concepts of everything, it's so rigid, and we've taken, and I also know that I'm vulnerable to this in holding rational thought up on a pedestal, but like our own actual animal bodies know this reality of time. And of course, it took me to need to read a physicist's book to be like, oh, okay, duh.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for validating my experience.
Totally.
Thank you, science, for validating my experience, and like needing that too. And I'm not, and I'm just saying that as a way to laugh at myself. But what could it really look like if we were to trust our animal knowing in our bodies more in our experiences? And to also just trust that. So here's a direct example and experience. I moved from Portland, Oregon to Denver, Colorado recently. And I grew up in Oregon. I was, for this past stint, 8 years in Portland, Oregon, had cultivated a really deep and wide community, and also had done like a lot of good community work, and loved that place very much because of the community. And moving is always a really stressful, pretty jam-packed experience. I was also wrapping up a 7-year job, and my whole experience exiting Portland was so beautiful. Like, it was so expansive, and I got to see and engage with the people in the way that I wanted to engage with. There were just so many moments when I didn't even have to look at the time. Like, everything just kind of flowed into one after the other, and it would wrap up, not, like one moment with a friend would wrap up, and it would give me exactly the amount of time that I would need to get to like my next friend. And it just was such a generous and spacious experience during a very emotionally fraught time of saying goodbye.
Yeah.
That was a really incredible, like I felt very much in alignment. moving to Denver, though, I was like completely dislocated, even though I was like I was ready for, being unscheduled. I, like missed 2 appointments because I was just like, oh, I'm just going to float. And then all of a sudden I was like, crap, I totally forgot that I was supposed to be on this grant panel that I had agreed to be on. I missed an appointment with my financial advisor, like all this stuff that I was supposed to do as an adult. I just completely I had no concept of time. I knew that days were passing, but then I would also do, my ego needed things to be comfortable with. So I was running a lot of errands. And it just was this really strange, I felt so discombobulated, but there was no actual, I guess, scheduled reason for me to feel that way because I was wholly unscheduled for the most part. But my body was going through something that I wasn't actually recognizing or giving it credence or space to actually process through. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with a friend who reflected back to me that it's only been 4 weeks. You've literally left a home that you've known for so long. You've left a whole entire community. You just got married, and learning how to be in a marriage is also a lot. You're doing just slow down. And I was so unaware that I wasn't slowing down. But it was again, if we're talking about time, my quality of experience of time in Portland versus my quality of experience with a place like Denver, which is a place I don't know, those quality of experiences were so different.
Yeah.
And literally what split them apart was a 19-hour drive. If we were to talk about time in these sorts of blocks, but that's not actually really how time is experienced. But when you think about that, it's I lit the portal. If we were to time that portal was only 19 hours. And it thrusted me into a completely different existence.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so part of reading Rovelli's book that really helped to ground me was recognizing that, oh my gosh, it's not linear. It isn't progressive. It isn't that because you had an incredibly beautiful time saying goodbye to Portland, that somehow was going to transfer, or that you're going to continually progress in this way. Right. That the sort of even the concept of progression is problematic when it's tied to time, because it's just the capitalistic model. Right? Yeah. It's just the ways in which we're colonized. It's the ways in which we've been patterned to believe that that's what progress is supposed to feel like or be like or look like.
Yeah.
And I think so much of this is based in our concept and experience of time, and how we conceptualize what time, supposedly I'm supposed to be a certain way at 37 compared to when I was 24, which is complete bullshit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or these ridiculous age markers of, quarter life. Okay, now I'm 30. Okay, now I'm 40. I'm supposed to be a certain way. And, I talk about this not because I've figured anything out, but I talk about it because I'm also so vulnerable to all of these really oppressive concepts of how we're supposed to live and be. And I think time is an ordering and a framework in which that is structured around. I think about it as the skeletal structure, right? In which the way that capitalism hangs its immense, ugly skin on.
Yeah. It reminds me of that painting. Is that by Dali? Where time was kind of melting on, it was hanging on the tree and it was kind of melting. Yeah, wow. Some of what you were saying led me to this idea that we have put or maybe not even idea, but really kind of a phenomenon, right? That we've put a lot of attention towards studying or applying time as a quantitative measure, but we haven't always put in the time and the effort to study time as a qualitative thing or through a qualitative lens. And so I'm curious to hear if, how do you think your astrological study has changed your relationship with time, especially because astrology, so much of astrology is studying the quality of time, right?
Right.
And like I've been thinking a lot about how astrology is like time fuckery,
Yeah.
because if you are standing in the present moment and you're looking at the current transit, and then you're comparing the current transit with your birth chart, right, which happened, I don't know, however long ago when you were born, then you believe that the quality of time at that moment of your birth has bearing on your current, what's going on currently, right?
Yeah.
So without that very basic assumption, the whole astrology falls through, right? Like you
Yeah.
literally cannot proceed reading a birth chart if you don't believe that the past has a hold over the present, or
Right.
that the past is somehow still alive in the present. So I'm curious to hear like how this exploration has been for you. And also, yeah, maybe if you want to share a little bit about how you come into astrology, what's your relationship with astrology?
hmm Yeah, I mean, I think astrology, I heard an astrologer, I think Renee Sills, she's an embodied astrologer. I'm going to plug her because she's
She's great.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's so great. She talked, she talks about how astrology is understanding oneself as, I think this was her. She talks about understanding oneself in epic time and
Mm,
understanding one's story epically, right?
yeah.
There is a particular level of threshold. I'm really drawn to things that are, it doesn't stop me from wanting to figure it out. um, when I access third house, ninth house, it doesn't stop me from wanting to figure it out. But I'm really drawn to things that are, in some ways, trying to explain the inexplicable.
Mm-hmm.
Like to a certain level, for example, like there's this debate, right? It's like, are we in Aquarius? Like, is it the Aquarius like era,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God, there's like so much debate, and I haven't even gotten into it, so I can't really talk about it in any sort of in any intellectual or any grounded way. But there's an inability to agree on whether or not we're even in the time of Aquarius because
Mm-hmm.
we can't conceptualize that much information.
Yeah.
And, we haven't, I mean, as far as when recorded history, like recorded written history, like we don't even have the data. So there's something like really incredible about astrology. And this is really what drew me to astrology, is trying to explain in a way with mythological language and sort of archetypes that are fluid, right? Like we all have a certain understanding of these archetypes. We know them. I think we know them in our bodies. We've lived them enough. I think we've evolved with them enough that they have been integrated, I think, into our physiology.
Yeah.
And there's a fluidity of like being able to use that in a way to tell a sort of epic story that gives a sort like that pulls the framework, I think, off the earth. And I do this a lot when I'm feeling really bogged down by what I call the human drama.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're in class together, that I care very much about racial justice. I care a lot about social issues. I care about the environment. I care a lot about a lot of those things. And one thing that I'm always reminded about when I go back into nature, or when I read physics books, or when I study astrology, or there's also this incredible Netflix documentary called The Great Unknown, I think, or The Unknown, which has like a bunch of different scientific experts, like a microbiologist, an astronomer, a psychologist, a neurobiologist, all of these different, and they like go through this journey of explaining the things that they don't know, and about how like there's something like 1.7 trillion, anyways, there's just like, so like, like neurons, the astronomy, like the universe, the ocean, microbiology, like all of these, like we haven't even gotten to the frontier of a lot of this stuff, right? And it just reminds me, I'm like, we spend so much of our time worrying and we keep mucking up the stuff that we already know, it's like, okay, like science is not going to save the environment. Okay. Like actually this podcast is about future languages. And I was actually thinking about this, about how maybe the future languages is actually a returning back to, it's like returning back to indigenous land practices, returning back to our deeper knowing, like returning back to, it's like right now, indigenous folks are burning, the Pacific Northwest to save it from forest fires, because indigenous land practices, they knew that fire is medicine, could burn away the bush that would create uncontrollable fires. So I'm just like, you know what I mean? Like I get so frustrated sometimes when I get like really mired into the like human drama of what we know. And when I'm just like, okay, but there's so much we don't know. And that's like really what drew me to astrology, is that there is always room for the unknown, or there's always room. And even though astrology is an incredibly intellectual practice, there is something specifically about the occult and studying these patterns that isn't grounded in what feels like the way in which we gene splice things.
I agree.
It feels much more integrated, like to be in relationship with the planets with something that you can't see is inherently itself it's a radical way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
To be able to look to the sky, to the planets that you don't even see with your own eyes, to garner some sort of deeper narrative about your own human experience on Earth, is, if you can respect that, then you can respect the relationships of other things that you don't know or can't see, right?
Absolutely.
And so and again, it doesn't make me, I still want to know everything.
Me too. I hear you.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot. But I also hold a lot of space and acknowledgement that there will always be the unknowable. And I think that's what I also love about quantum physics, because they cannot explain why you can't determine where a photon is going to go, because there is that God principle, right? Like there's that unknowable divine at work that we can't possibly know everything. And then that's also part of the beauty and part of the mystery. And I hope, right, if we could lean into that more, that we could just accept, we could just be. And I also think that Buddhism and evolutionary astrology also has very similar tenets.
Yeah, that's something that I've kind of sensed into as well. I do want to just point out, what I think is interesting, that you brought up quantum physics and astrology. And I feel like in their own ways, these are two different disciplines, one coming maybe more from the present/future, and the other one really coming from ancient times, that are breaking down this Newtonian way of looking at the world. The mechanistic worldview is kind of dissolved as we introduce these other principles. But yeah, what you had pointed out about Buddhism, and I don't know that much about Buddhism. I've read a couple texts from Buddhist teachers, but that doesn't make me any sort of expert in Buddhism.
Good, me too. I'm not an expert either.
But you've walked the path. You've walked the path. And
I don't know if I've walked the path. I joined
studied
Sangha.
the teaching. Okay.
Yeah, I read the Dhammapada pretty regularly, but yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm, yeah.
Okay.
I'm aligned with it.
You're aligned with it. Okay. So I'm curious to hear then, like, how you, where do you think the overlap is there?
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, in Buddhism, there's a belief in reincarnation too. So in evolutionary astrology, right, it's all about how the soul has reincarnated into this life cycle and what it's meant to do here.
Yeah.
And Buddhism isn't so much about that. Another thing that I love about Buddhism too is that so many of the precepts are open. They're not, I think that some translations of some Buddhist texts are a lot more didactic than some other ones, but also the fact that it was never meant to be a religion to begin with also speaks to me. I'm just like, this was never meant to be codified in any sort of dictatorial cosmology, but because humans are the way that we are, we made it into a religion. So I don't study it as such. And, I'm also reminded by that there are a lot of different Buddhists, right? There are people who are Jewish and Buddhist. There are people who are Christian and Buddhist. There are people who are secular and Buddhist. So it really is, I think, a path. Some things that remind me, I think, a lot, I mean, especially in our class, Sabrina talks a lot about thought forms. A lot about the ways in which we can change our thought forms. And, there's definitely, I think, the spiritual community, there's a lot of, whatever. I think the largest well-known one is The Secret, right? Think about what you want and you'll attract it to you. And in Buddhism, like so much of the practices around we are conditioned to be a certain way. Basically, like the easier path is to be a worse human in many ways. Like to be reactive, to get hooked onto things, to spiral because you have a feeling about something. And so much of the practice is about recognizing that those thought forms are of the mind and that they're illusory. And that this world is not real because it's all perception. And so much of the practice is about honing your will, right, towards greater compassion, towards equanimity, towards being able to access this sort of more subtle experience or this more subtle truth, which is like capital T truth. And I see a lot of similarities in our class around, I think, using astrology in tandem with this practice of being able to have the information and then being able to have the free will to make decisions, right? To be able to change our thought forms so that we're more spacious or more generous so I see a lot of kind of overlapping, and especially around the discussion around consciousness. I mean, Buddhism is the study of the mind. It's essentially you are becoming aware of your mind's patterns. And I think about so much around, I mean, everything that we do is a concept of the mind. Yeah. And even astrology has been conceptualized by humans, or maybe not, actually, maybe aliens. I don't know. But it is a human tool. Yeah. It is a human tool that we use similarly the way that the scientific method is a human tool. The way that, I mean, another thing that I really love about our class in evolutionary astrology is the interwovenness of depth psychology and astrology. growing up, I've always been really suspicious of psychologists for the longest time. And I would say that they're not super helpful. I would say that the esoteric and the occult and folks who are mystics and life path coaches oftentimes work better for me. Because I think with psychology, right, like there's this perception that it's grounded in reality and that it is truth, like capital T science truth. When really it's exactly the same. It's just a different framework to understand the self.
Yeah.
Which astrology is exactly that. It's just more mythic and a lot more fun, and it's way more interesting. But when we're able to merge, I think the sort of phenomena of the mind or the study of the mind, psychology with astrology, which is like the study of the planetary bodies and like time and change. There's like this really, and then of course like Buddhism is also the study of the mind and like being quiet and being able to sit and understand so that you can come into right relationship in your life.
Yeah.
I think that they're all talking to each other. The way that my friend and I talk about it is like so many of these esoteric studies, and I would put quantum physics in this category as well, is that they all feel like they have different. We all have we all have our hands on the elephant, and we're all blindfolded. We all have hands on the elephant, which is like like capital T truth. And, Buddhism has like its hand on the trunk. Astrology might have its hand on its rump or something. Yeah. Quantum physics might have its hand on its foot or something. But like we all have a hand on a part of it. We don't have the full picture. But they all seem to be talking towards the same sort of phenomenon of like this experience of this undefinable experience of being alive.
Yeah.
Of this phenomenon of consciousness. Like consciousness is the same as our unknowability of the universe. It's the same as like our inability to understand the depth of the ocean. It's just, there's no way that we can, after studying the brain for so long, like neuroscience, we don't understand where dreams come from. Like, we don't understand. But so much of these, I think, old teachers, like I just learned about dream yoga. Do you know about dream yoga?
I don't.
Okay. I didn't either, but it's so cool. Now I'm like, where can I find a dream yoga practitioner? I just learned about dream yoga it's about accessing the subconscious. And there's so much wisdom. So like, is the future just a returning back to, right? Like, is it actually just a returning back to, and in the I-Ching in particular, and I'm not an I-Ching anything, I just came upon it because literally the universe like dropped it into my lap. But I
feel like there's an interesting story there.
There is an interesting story there. Yeah.
You want to tell it or not really?
Oh, sure. Oh, I can. Yeah,
okay.
Sure. So how I came across the I-Ching. So my ethnicity is Chinese, born in the US. So I'm Chinese American. Never had any sort of concept about the I-Ching. And a couple years ago, I started doing this book called The Gene Code, which is written by, it's written by a white guy. Anyways, it was very helpful, but the whole entire book is structured around the natal chart and also based around the framework of the I-Ching. So I think that this guy channeled it. I did it. It was like helpful for me at the time. And I just remember thinking, I'm like, oh, the I-Ching. I'm like, oh, I should read, because it's a book, right? So I was like, oh, I should read it. Then I remember talking to my roommate in the kitchen, and he said, well, the I-Ching isn't really a book that you read. And I didn't really understand what he meant by that. But then I was like, okay, go on. Life goes on. And this was during a period of time when I was like really deeply steeped in my own shadow practice. So I started meditating. I was doing it's called the Gene Keys. That's what it's called. I was doing the Gene Keys. I was also part of this experimental creative writing workshop around trauma and the voice. And then I was also simultaneously taking this workshop called Healing from the Trauma of Racism for People of Color. So all of that amalgamate, it was just like so much deep diving work into trauma, and just, it was a very powerful year. Fast forward to the beginning of the following year, which is actually 2020, or no, yes, 2020. And we all know what happened in 2020. So at the end of February of 2020, I went on a 10-day silent meditation Vipassana retreat, and came back and I was like so clear. I had never been so clear in my life. I was also extremely sensitive, like, to external environments. And I felt like I was so centered for a couple of days. And then of course, like after re-entering the city, like that really only lasted about 2 days. But my first full day back to work, I had a creative writing workshop that I was sitting in. And for that creative writing workshop, it was at a low-income housing in the community room. And at the halfway mark, at the break, there was a little free library in the community room. And before the Vipassana retreat and like after doing the Gene Keys, like I had this sort of like loose intention that I was going to find the I-Ching somewhere. I come out of the 10-day silent meditation retreat. I go to work the next day. I sit in this creative writing workshop. We take a break. I go to this free library, and right there was a copy of the translated copy of the I-Ching. And I looked up at the sky and I said, I think this is for me. Thank you. And it was the John Legg translation, which is, anyways, FYI, it's so bad. But I had it with me because I was like, oh my gosh. And I felt so seen by the universe at that moment. I was so at peace. And I took it and I was reading it. And then a couple days later, I was in my therapist's office, and we were doing the therapy thing. I had my backpack. I was digging stuff out of my backpack because I was looking for chapstick, and I pulled the I-Ching out of my bag. And this is when my therapist said, hey, I also use the I-Ching. And then he started telling me about Alfred Huang, about this master Alfred Huang, who he had heard about, who had studied the I-Ching during the Cultural Revolution in China with these 3 elders, and ended up getting thrown into a work camp because they found out that they were studying the I-Ching. Because of course, every sort of cultural text at that time was like banned. Yeah. So he got thrown into a work camp. His teachers and his friends ended up dying at the work camp. Because he was younger, he ended up surviving. And the Chinese government at the time decided not to kill him because they didn't want him to become a martyr. So then they released him like years later. And in the 1980s, he came to the US and he was like 80 pounds, but he basically nursed himself. He's also like a Qigong master, and he like nursed himself back to health. And he had, he had the inspiration to, because he realized that there were like no English translated I-Chings that weren't written by English speaking white people. So he was like, I want to do this. Right. So my therapist is telling me that there's this copy written by a Chinese man who has studied the I-Ching. There is a translated copy of this I-Ching. Okay. And I was like, all right, I'm going to find it. There was a bookstore directly across from his office. And this is another one of those like sort of synchronistic moments, is that his therapy office was actually on the opposite side of town where I usually go. But for whatever reason today, he was in Northwest Portland. There was a bookstore directly across from his office that I went to. And I went to the front desk and I said, yeah, do you all have a copy of the I-Ching? And they said, oh yeah, there's an I-Ching section. I went over to the I-Ching section. There was no Alfred Huang translation. And so I asked the guy, I was like, well, do you have the Alfred Huang translation? And he said, oh, Yeah, I can see the cover right now. I think we have one copy in the back. He brought it out to me and I went up to the front and I said, I knew that this was going to be here for me. And I took it home.
Wow.
And I mean, and I have no idea, how to commune with the I-Ching. So I learned from my therapist because he practices through the I-Ching. And some really like incredible, I mean, it is older than the Bible. It is, at least I think my facts are right. But it's a divination text that is, one, very esoteric. The translations are like, I mean, at least a lot of the astrology books that we read are written by English language speakers. So like so much. So I don't commune with the I-Ching a lot, but there is like this like distortion of, it's not even a distortion of time. It's actually, the I-Ching works in time the way that Carlo Rovelli explains time in quantum physics. And so in the I-Ching, there is such a thing. So I communed with it recently and my therapist like helped me to discern like what the meaning was. And he said that he's like, okay, this, what came up was that it's too far in the future, that it's too soon to tell. He's like, does that make sense? He's like, it's too far in the future that it's too soon to tell. And when I think about that, he's like, does that make sense? And I was like, okay, I can't actually tell you in any sort of linear, logical, cogent paragraph that I understand what that means, but my body knows what that means. And the I-Ching is like incredibly powerful because he was saying that you have to get clear with your question that you're answering, because you're essentially setting the GPS in the quantum field. So if you're not clear, if your question isn't clear, or if your intentions aren't clear, the I-Ching will guide you to a point in the quantum field. It'll lead you somewhere, but it just might not be, and so, so when I think about even like these, like, these esoteric texts, these like sorts of divination tools, I mean, the tarot, like astrology, the oracle cards, like they are sourcing from something that is beyond, we're in the field, but that we cannot immediately sense because our patterning of our minds and the concepts of our minds, the colonization of our minds has disengaged or disallowed us from being able to be plugged into that realm all the time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's my I-Ching story.
Wow. I love that. And it reminds me of the beginning of Cosmos and Psyche by Rick Tarnas, because in that book, Richard Tarnas was talking about how at least one of the conception that he came up with, in terms of how astrology works, right? I mean, he obviously put it so much more eloquently than this, but the tenet of his argument was that, imagine a universe where everything is connected, and that the planets were simply, it's not really a manifestation, but it's like it points to the fact that it's connected. Like it reminds you that it's connected, right? So when something is aligned astrologically, it's not that the planet caused it, but it's the planet is working in concert with the whole of the interconnected reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we have so many examples of this, right? I mean, 2020, unnamed, right? What was it? Saturn and Pluto conjunct. And then COVID-19 happened.
Yeah.
Right. And then what ended up with COVID-19 was that it spread across the whole entire world. Like no one was immune from that.
Yeah.
I mean, some people thought that they were, but it's just like, I mean, and if you think about it, right, if we think about the way that we think about like our supply chains, like that is still a thing, right? Like how we have like bubble tea shortages because somewhere all the way across the world that is producing, boba is just like, I mean, there's so many supply chain issues. If that doesn't tell us that we're all connected, I don't know what does. And I think that that's something also about Buddhism that reminds me, because in America, we're so individuated,
Yeah.
right? Like American individualism is, I mean, is like such a deeply ingrained concept, and something that I am also deeply vulnerable to all the time, especially when I get into arguments with my partner. I'm like, you're you, I'm me. We're like,
Yeah.
um, but I remember, I forgot his name, but anyways, he's a Kingian nonviolence practitioner, and he was doing a Dharma talk through the East Bay Meditation Center, and he was talking about, and we were doing this meditation, and also he had this, he was talking about when you wake up, can you like, who like, how is this coffee possible? This coffee is possible because somebody in a different country cultivated it for you and shipped it to you. Like, what about the floor that you're standing on, or the house that you're living in, or the cup, the mug that you're drinking out of? Like, we are inherently connected all the time, and we don't think about that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not part of our immediate consciousness of awareness. And that's one thing that I really love about Buddhism, is because it also reminds me of that when I'm in my higher self, you know. But it also recognizes too that it's like, you know, there is also this, I mean, and I think, you know, what you said about Rick Tarnas, like we are all interrelated, but because we're so individuated, and I get it too, because I mean, how could you possibly survive without an ego that is so porous? Like, if we were to exist in that reality all the time, like, we would not survive this world, right? Like, it would be impossible to live. So I'm like trying to find that sort of, I guess, like that middle path of recognizing that we're all connected, but then how also can, you know, while also being individuated, but not, I don't have an answer.
Yeah. And
But
I don't know if like really an answer is what we are inching towards either.
Yeah.
You know, it's really kind of, I think this, you know, and we're recording this during Libra season, like it is perhaps the constant push and pull between the two, right? There's no, it's not something to be solved. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes I think the questions can get us closer to whatever it is that we're trying to get closer to.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
All right, Jenny. So as we're drawing to a close, I'm curious to hear, you know, usually I offer up that phrase, future language, for folks to kind of, you know, share some thoughts around that. But I feel like we already did that. So I'm really curious just to hear, you know, where folks can find your work, or maybe connect with you, or maybe you don't want people to connect with you. Where are you at in that journey, and kind of, maybe like where we can find you if you want to be found.
Oh my gosh. That's also a big question. I mean, I do have an Instagram. I'm not super active on it. It's Asian_auntie. AZN_AUNTIE. I do check my direct messages though, so if you want to get a hold of me there,
I'll put a link.
Yeah, there is. I feel like I've been kind of under the surface for a while, and I've been doing a lot of internal work, and I don't know when my sort of extroversion self is coming back out, but yeah, there might be a blog. I don't know. I have no idea. But yeah, right now I'm just like, I'm very down for like one-on-one, very meaningful, genuine, authentic engagement, and less about this like casting a huge social media net of experience. But yeah, if you want to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me there. And yeah, I'm doing astrology readings as a student astrologer for the time being. So if people are interested,
you're a great astrologer. I've had a reading with you.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, always down to kick around ideas. So
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jenny. This has been
yeah.
such a nourishing conversation for me. And I feel like I'm just always amazed by the way you think and the way you carry yourself. And just, the grace that I mean, obviously, Libra rising, you know how to carry yourself. And you just have such a beautiful combination of compassion and also groundedness, which is just so beautiful. I can really see that, Libra and Capricorn in you. So thank you for being in my world and thank you for this conversation.
Oh my gosh, Jonathan, it's all mutual. I think you have an incredible mind. And yeah, I feel so blessed to be able to have had this conversation with you.
Yay. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's it for my conversation with Jenny Chu. I hope that you found some inspiration and maybe you feel a little bit energized after our conversation. I certainly felt that. As always, you can find all the ways to connect with Jenny on social media, and I will link all of her links in the show notes below. Her Instagram handle is Asian Auntie Astro, which I just find absolutely incredible. And she's currently offering a 1-hour natal chart reading, which you can schedule directly on her Calendly link. Or you can also reach out to her directly via Instagram if you have any questions about that session. I highly, highly encourage you to book a session with Jenny if you feel called. My session with Jenny was incredible. I found that she was really easy to talk to, and we got into pretty deep stuff without it really ever feeling heavy. So yeah, I feel like I really came away with a deeper understanding of myself, and some of Jenny's insights on my chart were just brilliant. If you found this podcast or this conversation inspiring, nourishing, or helpful in some ways, I would love, love, love it if you could subscribe, rate, or review this podcast with 5 stars or whatever is the highest ranking on your podcast app. If you think that someone else will benefit from this episode, please share with them too, whether that's on social media or maybe privately with a friend or a member of your community. All right, until next time, I hope you take good care of yourself, and I'm sending you so much love. Thank you for listening.